I'm going to show you how we work on integration of an ATNR and an STNR through promoting proper cervical range of motion. So if this is within your scope, this is a very effective tool in opening up kids' cervical mobility, allowing them to disassociate cervical movements from limb movements. So with the strong ATNR, that left head rotation, those right flexors are all going to fire simultaneously. So points to consider here is that the body should always be as still as possible. So if you're working on a kid's cervical motion and their arms are flailing all over the place, you're really decreasing your effectiveness. So by having staff engage that child, or even having the child hold their arm in a position, or really be aware of trying to keep their body still while working on the movements, that's going to make it more effective. So if Mr. Taylor here has a right ATNR with left elbow bend, so if we turn to the right, a lot of times if a child is supine, so laying on their back, you can even check this. So if you have an infant or a kid that won't go quadruped for you, but they will lay down, and you just check and like really quickly like turn their head one way, you're gonna see that contralateral pec fire. So if Mr. Taylor, if you can kind of demo that. So if I turn, and you'll see that shoulder raise and this pec tonicity increase. So you can use this as a measure for a kid that you know has an ATNR, but you want to see how severe, but you can't really get them to hold quadruped position, which is pretty rare. But you can also check your asymmetrical tonic neck reflex in this position without always having your kids go quadruped. So just a quick note on things to be aware of, and then also make sure that while you're working on this cervical range, you're not engaging that reflex. So if you're just tying that reflex in, that's like Old Faithful for those kids. It's these motor patterns that are linked together that you're trying to break. So one, if like Mr. Taylor here, as cognitive as he is, I could say, hey, like when I'm turning, you really try to relax this shoulder. Or I could have a staff or therapist work on engaging that shoulder and keeping it down manually, or holding their elbow and wrist extended. Or if I'm by myself, I could even hold this arm in like an extended position and then just have the child turn their head towards or away from the direction I'm working on. And then I could implement that range of motion that we talked about. So really the end game for range of motion is cervical. So if you start there, a lot of times that's way too much input for these kids. Starting with more distal structures like shoulders and elbows and wrists, or hips and knees, allow you to prime their cerebellum to then allow you to work on their cervical movement. So do those things first, normalize their shoulder range of motion, normalize their hip and knee and foot and ankle, and then you can work your way up to their neck, okay? So some things to be aware of. If you're solo, you can work on range of motion. So sometimes I'll just hold the child's head in my hand, I'll work on their arm simultaneously. Best case scenario is if I can say, hey buddy, can you relax this here? Or if I have a staff member or a therapist, work on keeping that there. When you're working on cervical range, again, the more complex you can be with your range of motion activity, the more beneficial it's going to be. So I'm not just turning in the same plane every time. So what I mean by that is I'm not just cranking his head over and over and over. That's too simple. He's not developing any differentiation of movement. What I want to do is kind of play around with where do I see that pec fire if I do. Sometimes it's in more cervical flexion with rotation. Sometimes it's in more extension. Sometimes it's at neutral. But what I want to do is essentially kind of work the corners and work around and work through those ranges that elicit that reflex. So with Mr. Taylor, what I'm going to do to start is this essentially keep him neutral and just do some slow ranges of motion and see if we can maintain stillness and no reflexive movement and activity in that shoulder. So their chin should be able to go in line with their shoulder. So you should have about 90 degrees of cervical rotation bilateral. Okay, so he has nice full motion this way, no reflexive activity in that shoulder. So this would be a simple way just to check and kind of start to work on things. But then I could start to maybe go into some cervical flexion. So many of these kids and some of these people spend time in that upper cervical extended position with that forward head translation or that anterior head carriage. So they really develop a lot of mobility with that chin extended or that upper neck extended. But if you can put them into a flexed position and then start working on that range of motion, you're going to see a lot more reflexive activity coming from that shoulder. Even when you're checking an ATNR quadruped, if a child has their head extended, a lot of times you won't see anything, but as soon as you pack their neck and put them in a neutral position, right away you're going to see that elbow start falling out and that pec start firing. So a lot of times what you're going to find yourself doing is while you're working on range of motion, you're going to be tucking their chin. So I'm using my fingertips, so my middle and my ring finger, I'm hooking their mastoid, which is technically your temporal bone, but essentially like your occiput here, and I'm providing a little decompression to that. So I'm kind of tractioning up towards me, and then I can use my thumbs to then kind of cervical flex here. So having the patient kind of tuck their chin, and then from there, I'm really slowly going to work on rotating and see if I can get to that full 90 degrees of rotation, okay? Sometimes you might only get to here and you see that pec fire. What I want to do then is kind of maybe change the angle, kind of open up, go a little bit further, then I might flex a little bit, and then I can go a little bit further, and up there the pec engages, so I'll go a little bit at extension, I'll rotate further, and then I'll go into flexion again. But you're really trying to find your way to get that child fully rotated without engaging that shoulder. So it could be just simply having their head turned, playing some guessing games, working on right range or left body range of motion. It could be keeping this still, or having a therapist fix that arm, and then working on cervical range of motion. You could also play around with the headpiece or the angle that their head is, or their neck is really oriented in. So I could go into a little bit more extension here, and then from there I could flex again and then work those slow ranges, and then from there I could work on some flexion extension. I could rotate a little bit more, flexion extension. One really good way to open this up is have the child actually engage their deep neck flexors, which is something that a lot of us are really weak in. Therapeutically, this goes a long ways in integration of a asymmetrical tonic neck reflex and a symmetrical tonic neck reflex, just by getting their neck stronger. So in this case, what I'm going to have the patient do is I'm going to put them in that position that I encouraged before. So I'm going to kind of scoop under their mastoid. I'm going to flex them down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift them up. I'm going to have them hold their head there for 10 seconds. So this is a really neutral position. Strengthening my deep neck flexors also lengthens my neck extensors. You'll see a lot of these kids immediately, they'll start to shake and they'll start to titubate because their mid-cerebellum has never coordinated this movement, and their deep neck flexors are so weak. So when you're working on a cervical range of motion, you can simply add a couple strengthening components to this. This is an easy one for parents to do at home with their kids to work on neck strength. And a lot of times if you're able to activate those deep neck flexors, you can actually really open up ranges of motion in a neutral head position. So if I'm working on rotation, those are a couple layers that you can build into that. You can also work on just deep neck flexion in general. So I can flex his neck, and then from there, I'm just picking his head up. And then from there, I can turn a couple different ways, or I could really drop the headpiece and then work on cervical extension. So again, these kids have a really translator forward head posture. They have really limited low neck or low cervical extension. So you could work on some range of motion really slowly and gently in this position. Or if I'm going to more neutral, I can work on some long axis decompression of the lower and mid cervicals. So the combination of everything I just talked about is really good for opening up the neck, strengthening the neck, providing mobility, dissociating limb and cervical movement. But with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my middle fingers, and I'm going to come in, essentially palpate the traps, up to the base of the neck and the top of the shoulders. And then from here, what you want to see is when you lift up, you want to see the patient's head rise. A lot of these kids, their cervical spines are so fixated and they're so hypertonic that they don't even have that global cervical mobility. So by providing a long axis decompression, so I'm tractioning up the trapezius and I'm making contact. This would be C6 on that patient. So that first freely movable vertebrae. I can do repetitions where I'm coming up under that vertebrae and I'm lifting, and I'm coming up and I'm lifting, or I can maintain contact and just work on like a rhythmic long axis decompression. I'm kind of gently pulling and lifting simultaneous. So I could work individual vertebrae, so C6, C5, C4, or I could essentially work that whole cervical spine together. So great way to open up cervical extension, which is really limited in a lot of these kids. Play around with different angles. It should be multiple planes and multiple head positions to really open up and disassociate cervical and limb movement, which kids need to really develop their motor centers. So a lot of times you'll see kids with like genetic variations, or kids that are like really autistic, and they're going to be so tight and so fixated. If you can open up their cervical range of motion and their limb range of motion, it's going to be like a whole new world for these kids as far as motor development, motor learning, even like developing cognitive pathways and behavioral and attentional networks. Really start here, which is something that they should have when they're born. But there's just a couple of different layers that you could add to your cervical range of motion that really are helpful in helping these kids develop.
Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. To learn more or to schedule an intensive or anything with my team, there's a link below. Just go ahead and click that and that'll get you in the right spot. Have an awesome day.